Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Tonight's session is a precursor to another program that we're jointly doing, which looks more deeply into writing skills. Now, in the short time we've got to spend together tonight, I can't teach you to write a thesis or a dissertation, but I can share some of my perspectives on how to think through the writing process and how to get you writing. To me, the most important thing is not about making it perfect when we start, but it's about making sure we start and continuing that momentum throughout our entire PhD journey, because that's the challenge. The challenge is A, being motivated, B, being able to get our ideas from here onto the paper or into our laptops so that we have something that grows alongside us, because the thesis itself does grow. And as we spend more time reading, learning, researching, collecting data, analyzing data, of course, parallel to that is also the fact that the body of work that we create, i.e. our dissertation, plus anything else that might come along with it, that's going to grow with us as well. So tonight I have 4 objectives. One is to understand the common thesis structures to guide us in structuring our approach to writing. And I talk about common because there is no one way to put together your thesis or dissertation. Excuse me. But what there is generally accepted approaches. The second objective is to develop practical techniques to get you writing. And to me, that's the most important thing. I then want to be able to talk about the difference between writing and editing, because writing is one thing, editing is where we get ourselves to the finish line, but it's not the starting point. And finally, I just want to be able to offer some practical advice for continual writing and dissertation development. And I think that's where, most of us are here for is, look, how do I start? So we have sort of, the common idea about common dissertation structures. And I just thought I'd start with a cute cartoon. The structure of your thesis is going to be unique to you. And you need to be able to write it or to develop it in such a way that not only meets the university's expectations, but more than anything, it develops along with you as you develop as a researcher. So on the left, step 1, we know that we need chapters, but we don't necessarily know what they are. As we start on our PhD journey, we might look at an introduction, we might look at a literature review, we're going to look at a methodology chapter, but that might be as far as we get for the first year and a half, because that's where our focus is going to be. Before we even get data to collect, we've got to make sure that we're going in the right directions first. So, you're partway there. It then gets developed. And this one, part 3 here is quite cute. That chapter 4, that stuff you did your first year, stuff you're supposed to be doing now, and then you make up some stuff. But that really is a reality of what we're experiencing. So let's move into the real structures rather than the humorous side of the structures. So reality is there is no global standard for a structure of a dissertation, but there are common ideals. So my advice first is check with your university to understand what they expect. In Asia, the typical structure is the 5-chapter standard. And that really relates to both of the images there, but I prefer the image on the right, dissertation chapters. An abstract is not a chapter, but it is the first thing that we are going to see, or the first thing that somebody is potentially going to read when they open up your dissertation. Every dissertation needs to have an abstract, just as does every journal article or every perhaps conference presentation. The first chapter, chapter 1, will always or typically be your introduction. Chapter 2 will typically be a literature review. Chapter 3 will typically be research methodology. And it's this chapter 1, 2, and 3 that in its first form becomes your formal research proposal. So we start scaffolding and building up from this so that we can use things later on. But one of the challenges or one of the problems I think that's most common here is a lot of people spend the first year of their PhD journey writing their introduction, writing the literature review, writing the research methodology chapter, and then they leave it. But all of these chapters evolve throughout the entire dissertation process. So it's really important that you remember, even though you've submitted this as part of your progress review, and it's effectively, it has become, your research proposal, you've still got a couple more years worth of work to do on it. So you should always be refining it. You should always be adding to it. You should always be questioning it. So the challenge with writing is not that we write chapters in isolation to each other, but that from day 1 through to day submit, when we're putting the final version of our thesis, after we've got feedback through the Viva or Viva process, all of that we should be constantly writing, evolving, and editing. We then move into chapter 4, data analysis, chapter 5, results, and I kind of merge all of these together a little bit because I kind of want to stick to that chapter 5 thing. So results and conclusion often become sort of sometimes blurred in their distinction. And then you finally move on to bibliography. Now, in terms of this is the common structure. How do we go about choosing what is going to be the best structure for you? Now, I think back, my mentor, who really encouraged me far too many years ago, but who encouraged me to do research work in Asia. He did his PhD at the London School of Economics. And I have one of the only remaining copies of that PhD left in the world. It's over 40 chapters long. Now, the thing that I want to express here is, although there's a commonality, although there's the push towards the 5-chapter model, you have to work on what is best for you as a researcher. And most importantly, it is also about making sure that you can convey your research that you need. So what I've put here is thesis structure is determined by the nature of the research, by how much you need to convey, or effectively storytelling in the analysis and the conclusions chapter. Because that's the opportunity where you really take your research and you bring it to life. Because, no offense to everybody, but a literature review is not exactly exciting. A literature review is a scaffold that sets you up. But your real research is in the data that you collect, the analysis that you make of that, and the conclusions that you draw. And if you've got a considerable amount of complex data to analyze and to really weave into a narrative, then of course you may find that the number of chapters that you need, or the number of sections that you need in order to convey that in a clear way, is certainly going to exceed 2. And if that's what it takes, that's what you need to do. It's also going to hang on whether you've done any publications during your PhD journey, and whether these feature on or feature in on your dissertation. So in the Australian model, for example, it's encouraged that you do journal publications along the way. And rather than repeat these into your dissertation, you simply include them as loosely as a chapter in the PhD itself, because it's work that's already been done. So if you're working on something like that and it's the opportunity to include it or to embed it, that's of course going to push you outside of the 5-chapter rule. So my advice is to discuss with your supervisor really early on, determine what the university expectations are, also what the flexibility is there, and then what your supervisor feels is an appropriate structure for your research work. Now, having said this, remember, you are still in control. At the end of the day, as you're not writing the research up, but as you're editing it and you're refining it and you're perfecting the presentation of the research through the written word, you still are in control to be able to say, look, I know I need to do it in this number of chapters. So make sure that, talk and understand first, but the final decision does rest with you. Don't leave these conversations to the later part of your journey, though, because it's simply too late then to adjust if there are some relatively fixed guidelines from your university. So my last comment on this page is planning is everything, which it is. And the more we know about what's expected of us right at the beginning, the more we have the opportunity to structure our practices, to structure our writing into that particular style. So let's move on to something a little bit more interesting. Tonight is about both structures and evolving your writing. So I want to talk for a little while about the evolving your writing style. This is not me going to talk about how do you develop your personal identity as a research writer. We don't have enough time for that, but maybe in subsequent sessions or engagements, we'll have that opportunity to look more detailed about how you do create your own personal or your own unique style. But what I want to talk about tonight is, we're starting our research, or we're partway through our research. How do I literally just write something? And that's the most important. So where should I start my writing? A few points. I believe in concurrent writing. Now, if I can go back a few pages and we look back at this diagram again, let's take, for example, the abstract. You can write the abstract anytime you like in your thesis or your dissertation period, but at the end of the day, it's probably better towards the end. But alone, the abstract includes information from the introduction, because you're setting the stage. It includes an overview of the research methodology chosen. It may embrace small elements of the literature review to give direction as to why your research is needed today. It is certainly going to touch upon data analysis, both techniques and potential outcomes, therefore results, and it is going to lend to a conclusion. The one thing it doesn't include is the bibliography, but that in itself means this one element of your dissertation, which might only be 1 to 2 or maybe 3 pages. This one element features something from everywhere in your dissertation. If I talk about research methodology, my personal favorite topic, the research methodology chapter brings in things from the introduction. It brings in guidance from the literature review. It leads you to setups or establishments for the data analysis chapter, and it guides you towards results and conclusion as well. So my point with this is, as I look at my overall dissertation, I can't write one thing in isolation to the other. You know, there's always an opportunity to start somewhere to get started, and you'll see that as you develop your writing, your notes even in one area, they may overlap with other areas as well. So that's why I say I believe in concurrent writing. Don't, I must write chapter 2 today and only chapter 2. There will be ideas in there that you know you want to use elsewhere. It also means, you know, don't get yourself fixated on one piece of the journey and shut out all the other pieces. Focus on, look, this is in my mind today. Let me put it down, let me file it, and then come back later on. So each chapter does not live in isolation. You can write contributions to or sections of any chapter at any time. And I really want to encourage that, because it is about developing your productivity. It is about getting the ideas from your mind, putting them onto paper or putting them into your computer. And then later on, what you do with it is something different. Now, just, you know, as I guess as a bit of an aside to that as well, I believe that any writing is positive. So regardless where you start, or regardless where you wake up today and choose to start today from, you are still developing a contribution to your overall thesis. Now, a lot of people have the mentality that I really should get it right the first time. But truth is, that's irrelevant. You know, as we write different ideas, maybe we get a few paragraphs here and there for a different chapter. As we develop those, as our, 3 to 5 year journey evolves, we're going to change our mind, and that's okay. That's what editing is there for. But it's good to be able to see our earlier thoughts. It's good to be able to see how our thoughts have developed. Maybe it's also a great opportunity to see that some of our earlier thoughts, our gut instinct versus our informed knowledge, it is a great way to be able to see how we develop as a researcher as well. So for me, keeping all of these old drafts, keeping all of these notes, which are, pretty much lists, paragraphs, sections of a chapter, maybe even a whole chapter here and there. Recognize that it will change as you develop, but recognize that you can write it at any time. Not everything you write will be chapters. So that's something important to remember as well. A lot of people feel, a lot of candidates feel that there's a pressure to develop a whole chapter at a time. The milestone says I should have done my research methodology chapter by now. Yeah, the milestone says that, but it doesn't mean that you have to have it as a complete unit, because the only time the complete unit is really required is when you come to submit, A, for the Viva, B, for the final submission with amendments, if any. So you're not always going to be writing chapters. Sometimes you're going to be just looking at a part of a chapter, wanting to understand a process. Maybe, for example, you want to get your head around the ethical issues associated with interviewing patients. And that's fine. You write a section of a chapter. Later, you come back to that. You edit it. You question whether everything was still valid based on your experience after you've done the research, after you've conducted those interviews. Maybe there were more things that needed to be added, and you put that in there based on the experience of actually going through the process, rather than just thinking about what the process is going to be. I use a piecemeal system. I build layers of content. And what that means to me is I know roughly, and this is why I come back to the general dissertation structure, I know roughly what it should be, but I'm not ever going to pressure myself to write an entire unit, i.e. an entire chapter at one time. So I'm going to constantly be putting little bits together, but I'm always structuring that. So every time I write something new, I get out a new piece of paper. Now, you're probably thinking, hell, he's old-fashioned, he writes on paper. Yes, I still write my notes. I still structure my research on paper before I start with the computer. Because in my mind, you have a stronger connection to not only what you're writing, but how you think about it by forcing yourself onto paper. But you can do the same with electronic files by using the laptop. To me, what I do is every time I write something different, I don't keep to the same piece of paper. It's not consecutive. I get out a fresh piece of paper, I put my ideas, I put my thoughts, and then I put them into where I feel they belong, roughly within my structure. Now, you can do the same thing in terms of your actual using a laptop. But my advice here is don't have one file and edit it and delete stuff. Because the moment you start deleting stuff, you cannot go back later on to review it, which means some of your early thoughts, which may be valid later on, but you've kind of decided, I'll change it, get lost. So I always would have a master file for each chapter, but then within that, have a folder. Every time you start to write something, a new thought, a new section, a new couple of paragraphs even, start a fresh document for that. So you can not only track everything that you had, because you do want to be able to have that ability to track it, but you can copy and paste into the master file without losing everything. And that's what I mean by a piecemeal system. I'm building layers of content, but I've always got the opportunity to go back to see my early thoughts and to say, hey, I might want to revisit this. I might want to reconsider it. The key outtake I want to suggest for us is writing does not mean writing for perfection. All too often we have this mentality that I should get it reasonably right from the start. Probably because you've got a supervisor that says, I'd like to see good quality chapters. But the reality is writing is about putting your ideas down so that you can revisit them and you can restructure them later on. And I think that's the most important thing out of the whole experience. So let's take a look at the phases, the types of writing and the phases of where we have writing. And I've just put down a list of areas where we write because they all overlap each other in a way. So we have diaries, notebooks, backs of envelopes. We do free writing, and I'm going to spend some time on that tonight. We do note-taking. So as we're reading different literature, we should be separating that out. We should be taking notes on it. We might be identifying key quotes that we want to use, or key pages that we've got to come back to, or even just key theorists that we know we need to look up and talk about or think about into the future. If we're doing it that way, we might want to look at an annotated bibliography structure, where every time we read something, we read to understand a few different things. We read to understand their key output. We read to understand their key contribution to the discipline. We read to understand what innovations and methodology did they use. So those might become my simple 3 headings that I use in my notebook to make sure that every time I read something, I cover those 3 points with a few points. Now, it's note-taking, but it's the start of writing. And we've got to embrace the fact that every time we put something down onto paper, we're actually developing our writing, because even though it may not look like it on paper, it's coming together up here in our minds so that we are getting somewhere. We might be looking at writing a literature review. We might be doing frameworks. It could be proposals. It could be abstracts. It could even be a pilot essay or a chapter, or provisional chapters, draft chapters, edited chapters. So here's a cool thing. What's the difference between a provisional, a draft, and an edited chapter? Oh, and then I have the final drafts of chapters. So a provisional chapter is what I see it being and what I see it including. It's the scaffolding to try and get us to fill that in. That means we need to go to the literature. We need to look at our note-taking. We need to come back and we need to start hanging these different pieces of information off our scaffold. And then we've got to start focusing on the areas that we might have missed out. That means we've got to do some more reading. We've got to do some more thinking. We might need to figure out, how am I going to link some of these concepts together? A draft chapter is literally the first attempt at having a complete chapter. That's probably about 80% full. And what I mean by that is, you've got all the ideas explained. You've got all the information that you feel, or roughly all the information that you feel needs to be in there. And now it's ready to get feedback. And from feedback, then you get your edited chapters, okay? You adjust them around. You also get to tidy up the language, because a typical draft chapter, a provisional chapter, is not so much about the language that we're using, but it is more so about the ideas, how we're structuring the ideas, how we're framing the ideas, and how we're presenting the ideas. When we do edits, that's our time to make the language more appropriate. Now, I'm going to wade into a really controversial area here. I'm sure that some of you have concerns, fear maybe, or issues with the concept of plagiarism. And that's a valid concern. I see a lot of students who ask, how do I remove plagiarism from my chapters or from my research? And I've seen a lot of people answer this question with, don't plagiarize in the first time. Well, I'm not kind of in agreement with that, because I think in order to get the ideas from our mind or other resources onto our paper, sometimes the initial phases, it's easier to plagiarize. And I used to be very guilty of this. I would photocopy pages out of journal articles. I would cut them up, and I would take out a paragraph and I'd glue it to my piece of paper, and then I'd make notes afterwards. Now, the thing about editing is we de-plagiarize. This is where we change the structures, we change the choice of words, but it's also where we get to decide, you know what, am I citing this, or am I going to express it in a different way? Am I going to acknowledge, and how am I going to go about doing that? Now that becomes your personal writing style. Because as you develop, just like when we speak, we have a particular style or a particular way of speaking. When we write, we have the same thing. And when we come to editing, that's where we take this almost mishmash, this mix up of multiple styles and, inconsistencies and fears and, a little bit of plagiarism too. I'm going to be realistic. And it's where we take it and we say, okay, I need to make it sound like me. And that's what editing's for. So I'm not somebody who says, don't plagiarize from the beginning. I'm somebody who says, take what you need to, note it, so that later on when you're in your editing phase, you can work out what is the most appropriate way for you to deal with that section of text so that it fits into your brand or your style of writing. And once we've done that, we get our final drafts of chapters ready to put together as a dissertation, chapter upon chapter, of which we can then do a review to make sure the flow is there. We also work on introductions and conclusions. We might do a synopsis or an abstract. We might also do a conference presentation or a journal article. And noting that all of these have a different feel about them or a bit different style about them as well. We also have, in terms of types of writing, modes. Gosh, I'm going to hate saying that particular word, peripatetic writing. We write in different places, we write for different things. I used to find the best time, the best place for me to write was on the boat every morning and every afternoon as I was going from my home to my work. So I used to live on an island. I'd travel half an hour on a boat every day in order to get to the central city, and sitting on the boat with my little laptop in hand, typing away at things was fantastic. I can't work in a Starbucks, but I see lots of people who do it. Some people work best, in libraries. They're more inspired by the environment. Others look at diagram making. If you don't feel that you can get it out as words, draw it. Let that be the starting point for your writing. Because if mapping it, whether it be a mind map like Tony Buzan's ideas, or whether you're just drawing a diagram, linear structures, whatever, it's all elements of writing. And if that's what gets you started, embrace that for yourself. And if your supervisor says to you, well, that's not very good, just remind them that everybody has different learning and productivity styles, and that this is what gets you started on the points. We can have computer-assisted writing using downloads, cut and paste, longhand first drafts, which is my style. And some people can just sit there and write straight into the computer from notes. And there are times that I've done that as well. I've thought for weeks and weeks, and then I suddenly just sat down and I type it out. And I still do that today with opinion pieces or thought leadership pieces that I do for the communications industry. I'll just sit down at my computer. I'll have been thinking for half a day about a topic, and then suddenly I'll write maybe only 2 pages, but it's enough to get published in one of the industry publications or so forth. I'm going to make a case for daily writing. Now, when I come back to here, keep in mind the things like note-taking, like diagram making, like the fact that we can write in cafes or on a public train or whatever. You should be able to have, and you should be able to reasonably expect from yourself a situation where you can write on a daily basis. We'll go back to one of the famous books, Writing Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day. Okay, well, that's probably a little bit more structured. And on the other hand, I want to believe, and that's supposed to be a UFO, but it is reasonable and it is possible. If you are able to identify where and how you can write, set yourself up with that opportunity. So you are doing some writing every single day. There is, however, a mentality that we can do binge writing. And as I said, I'm guilty of doing this sometimes. You get this spark of brilliance, this brilliant idea. You've got some of your data, you've got your reading, you've got your text, you get this burst of inspired productivity, and suddenly writing is done. The thing is, reality for that does not happen every single day. So this model, the having the binge writing fantasy, is not something that you can expect out of yourself all of the time. Once in a while, when it happens, embrace it. Fantastic. You're getting somewhere. But when you try to make this happen every single day, it leads more to depression, it leads to self-blame, it leads to anxiety, it leads to unnecessary pressure. At the end of the day, we are not going to have brilliant ideas every single day. Likewise, our data, our text, our reading doesn't always come together. We might read something now, we might read something in 2 years' time, and those two things click together instantly. But you've got that 2 years between it of which it happens. We often get writing block, and I'm guessing a lot of us in here have at some stage during our postgraduate career, including masters, up to where we are today, had writer's block. I can sit at my laptop and have everything spread around me. I'm like, I have no idea. And it happens. It's more about what we do with our writer's block time than the fact that we have writer's block that we should be concerned about. What it can end out, the writing doesn't get done. So we often feel frustrated or feel like we might have failed because we didn't achieve our writing goal at the end of a writing session. So here's where it's going to be most important. I want to come back to the fact that writing is about getting something done. It is not about reaching a certain number of words. So when we are at primary school, and I remember this, at primary school, I think I was probably 10 years old, the goal was to write a one-page essay, and that was so much pressure. But the problem is, because we were pressured that way when we're younger, we pressure ourselves that way when we're older as well. So my thinking is to refocus. The aim is not about a fixed number of words or pages, but it's about something involving writing. So if every day you make a step to do something that involves writing, ultimately it snowballs and you will start to get that whole set, the developed thesis that will come along. We often think, and excuse the almost swear word here, I couldn't find the version that somebody had tidied it up to be a bit softer, but a lot of people think of, the writing project as a task. So they hold off until you have a stretch of time and then you just write. The problem with doing that is there's always going to be something to distract you along the way. So by having regular writing processes, by having the piecemeal approach, you actually have a better chance of putting things together. Now, I just think, as I put together my workshops, my webinars, I use that approach. I do a little bit of research one day, do a bit more the next day, do the next bit more, put it together, cut it out, move it around. But over a period of a week, I've put together what I wanted to express. But I've also given myself time to think about it. Rather than just go and do a whole lot of research, go do other work, and then wait for a day and say, you must do this. Because I know in that day when I must do something, other people will disturb me, whether it be staff, whether it be clients, whether it be business partner, all of that, there'll be something that disturbs me. So how do we get into a regular daily writing routine? And I call it love, not duty. Many of us feel like, oh, I have to write, I have to write, I have to write. It's almost like being guilt-tripped by a supervisor. But ultimately, we've just got to learn to love the process. We chose to do a PhD because there was something, a spark of passion. There was something in it that we really wanted to get, or we really needed to get out of it. So there is some love there. So my suggestion, try a writing ritual, especially spelling mistake, sorry, especially if it doubles as temptation bundling. So a writing ritual is some repeatable activity that makes a shift to a distinct or special mode or place. For me, if I'm going to write, like, for example, when I travel, I know that if I sit on a beach, I'm going to pick out my tab and I'm going to write, because that puts me into that frame of mind. Now, I can't go to a beach every day, but there is a place in my home that I can go to that compels me to write. I can go to a particular cafe and write. One of the things that I found really interesting, because this whole lockdown, the last 14 months, especially the early days when we couldn't leave our houses, when we couldn't go out and function like normal people. And most of us, morphed into the pajamas or office wear type scenario. My special mode to get me productive was to actually dress up and come to work in my home dressed up, complete with shoes, everything, even though it's my own home, because that put me in the mindset, you're here to do this. So whatever it is that takes you or it gives you that chance to be in that mindset, that's the repeatable activity. And once you're in that mindset, the working is potential. It's going to happen. The temptation bundling is pairing a habit that you're working to create with something that's instantly gratifying. So the gratification is not, I wrote a page. The gratification has to be something else. But that might be sharing with somebody and then getting, hey, I really like the progress. You're doing really well. That is going to be good. Okay. Regular writing is a kindness to yourself. One, because you're always hitting the ground running. Two, because our moods fluctuate considerably. It's okay to have great days. It's okay to have okay days. And it's also okay to have bad days. What we've got to do is make sure that we have days, which means we're making steps towards the final product. And sometimes those bad days are going to be terrible. And if all you can achieve on those bad days is one word, it's still, I believe, one word you didn't have. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes, okay? I also advocate having a once a week meeting with yourself. Now, I've called it the Sunday meeting, but it can be any day you like. There's a reason I say Sunday, because it's not your typical Monday to Friday work schedule. And I always tell people, please think of the PhD as a full-time job. Monday to Friday, 10 to 7, whatever your preferred hours will be, but treat it as a full-time job. So having a meeting with yourself just to put yourself in the framework and in the mindset for the subsequent week can actually be helpful. Okay, so hold a 30-minute meeting with yourself. Plan for when you're going to get your daily writing done. So as you're thinking through what you have to do for the next week, plan about making sure that you get writing time in there. Protect your writing time as well. Now, one of the great things about doing the meeting outside of the typical Monday to Friday PhD time is it's not the first thing you do on a Monday morning. You wake up Monday morning, you sit at your desk, oh, it's PhD time again. And suddenly all that pressure comes. By doing this outside of your usual working place, by doing this outside of your daily routine, it doesn't take up as much mental energy. You still got to think through things, but it's about planning rather than, oh God, how am I going to find an excuse not to do this or to avoid something? So have 5 minutes for a skeleton. Block off your commitments for the week. Have 10 minutes for a brain dump, which is basically a to-do list, all the tasks that you have to do. And I still do this every week. I've got a file, I'll show you, a file of my to-do lists here. And I just keep crossing things out. I keep adding to them. And then every couple of weeks, I rewrite the list so it's on a fresh piece of paper. But you know what? It does keep me focused. And then I spend 15 minutes for tasks meet time. So I assign each task a block of time and decide what to do with tasks that don't fit into the calendar. Now, if my goal is to write a section of a chapter, for example, I want to talk about ethics, the ethical issues I'm facing with the interviews I want to do. I know that I can write that in 2 hours, for example. I can get a reasonable draft out within 2 hours. But the thing is, when you cut corners, I suppose, or you sort of put frameworks on your time like that, it puts extra pressure. So if you think you can do it in 2 hours, allocate yourself 4. And you might think, wow, that's really generous. It's not about pressuring yourself. It's about making sure that the time you allocate reasonably permits or allows or facilitates you to undertake and complete the task. And it also means if you finish under that time, you've got that instant gratification, you've got that reward. I can go have a nice cup of coffee somewhere. I can go for a walk. I can go for a swim. There's all these little instant rewards I can give myself because I performed and I completed the task I had hoped to do within a period of time. And things that don't fit into your calendar, be prepared to break things up into segments because you're going to find lots of things that take far too long. And you're not going to want to spend 8 hours in a row doing the same thing. So look at how can I break that up. And then as simple as that, meeting over, done. So let's talk about practical writing strategies. This is the things you need to think about before getting you to started. Let's talk about practical writing strategies. Free writing. This is something I was introduced to a very long time ago by one of my mentors and the person who got me into teaching at university level. And I've always found it a really valuable tool. It was always presented to me as a starting point. You're not really sure what you want to do. So I used to even do this with workshops like this if we're face-to-face. We'd do this activity, but I would always use it as a starting point for you to think about a topic. But the truth is, at any time you feel that you are facing some form of writer's block or inability to structure your thoughts, the free writing activity works at any stage of your dissertation, at any aspect of what you're doing. So it's very simple. You write continuously for short fixed periods of time. Now, different people differ on this. It's sort of between 7 to 10 minutes on average. I like 8 minutes. 8 is both an auspicious number, but it also typically represents the human attention span, at least the human attention span before technology, before smartphones came in and shortened it down a little bit. But it is a good amount of time. Within 8 minutes, you can compartmentalize a number of things into one, and you can express what you need. After 8 minutes, one, you're probably going to get cramp in your hand from writing, but two, you've probably put down or dumped onto paper everything that you needed. Now, what you simply do is you take a piece of paper, and you can do this on a laptop too, but I'm old school, so paper and pen. But you write nonstop, no editing. If you make a spelling mistake, move on. If you don't like a word, move on. It's not about getting it right, it's about getting it down out there. So you don't worry about grammar, you don't worry about punctuation, but you should write in loop sentences. So some people will tell you, oh, write in full sentences. Truth is, we're trying to write what's in our mind, and our mind is a lot faster than our ability to write or type. So just get out there what you need to get out. Also, you write without any audience. So a lot of people write with the idea that what they're writing is going to be shown to somebody. In this case, this is only for us. So just write it for yourself. Try writing also without a purpose, without a focus. So it allows you to have flexibility to shift between different topics or different thoughts or different ideas. Now, why is this important? When we write with a focus, we instantly have an on-off switch. Either the content is a yes and it gets included, or it's a no because it's off topic and it's irrelevant. The problem is all that no stuff is still valuable for us. And that's why, again, I use pen and paper. I use scissors. I cut pages out because I can file one page in 2 different places because I went off topic. But what I went off topic was, oh yeah, I was thinking about that. That's important now. I have to remember that. It gives me the idea to make sure that all my ideas are represented. Structure is not important. So you don't need to bring it to a conclusion at the end of 8 minutes. So it's not about finding an answer. It's about getting those ideas out there onto your paper so you can work with it later on. Then what you do with that later becomes the most important thing. Now, some people call free writing junk writing, and I think that's because it is unstructured. It is effectively a dump of what you've got. But let's have a look at a few options here. Sit with your data, your primary data or secondary text you'll be working with and just write. So if we've got our data, this is about letting our intuition kickstart for us. What we can do is we can talk about patterns, summarize things, weird things. It just gets our first instinct with our data onto paper so that we can start grouping things together later on. This is your starting point so that you can develop further down. Use bullet points if you need to, but never ever cross anything out. You can free write about something you're stuck on. And this is where it becomes, quite a challenge because it is about thinking it out. It's about articulating the problem, working towards a solution, or even next steps. Okay. Worst case scenario is I'm sitting here, I got my pen in my hand. I'm in a nice silent room and I'm trying to think, what the hell do I write? If you can't put ideas onto the paper, There are a couple of things you can do. One, just write out keywords. What are the keywords that come to your mind? And even if that means you continue writing that same keyword 100 times, do it, because eventually it's going to trigger the next word, and that's going to snowball for you. But also, alternately, we're sitting there, we're struggling. We don't know what we can write. Ask yourself questions, because if you don't know, if there's nothing in your mind that you can write about, it means this is something you've got to learn. That's a good thunderbolt. This is something you've got to learn about. So ask yourself questions. What do I need to know? Where do I find this out? Why is it like this? How did this happen? Who invented this stuff? All these sorts of things. And then you make yourself a plan for what you do afterwards. So constantly questions. I have here, question over and over and over and over. It's fine, it gets into your mind. Later on, something might trigger a solution. You'll read something further down the track. It'll trigger a solution. You can come back to this. And then you can say, okay, you know what? I struggled then, but I get it now. And I'll give a great example of where that happened. A few weeks ago, I gave a webinar on sampling. And I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm a historical researcher. Anything to do with typical quantitative stuff, I don't enjoy. I understand it. But I thought to myself as I was preparing this over a period of time, and I was trying to write out what I wanted to talk about and that. In the 90s, I studied statistics at university. I studied statistics at university in 2 different departments. I studied calculus. I studied statistics for 2 years, first year and second year. In fact, I think I did 4 or 5 statistics papers all up. I hated it. And I never understood it back then. As I was preparing for that webinar, everything suddenly came together. And it was because I kept asking myself, why? I had all these questions. And all these years later, I read something else and it put it all into, almost all into context to me. And it suddenly, the last piece of the puzzle came together. In order to get that last piece of the puzzle, we have to have the questions as we go along, okay? The third one is free write in response to a question. So instead of giving yourself a topic, treat it as a brainstorming session. Put up a question that you have. Now, all research is derived from a question. Why is this like this? Why is this happening? Who is responsible for this? All of our research comes out of a question that we want to solve. Now we can have all these micro questions around as well. So as we look at a particular area, maybe we've got, you know, a whole lot of data that's come back. There's a couple of outliers and we don't understand it. What could cause this outlier? And you can spend your time. It's just simply letting all the ideas flow so that you can come back to that. Remember, right throughout the journey of the PhD, although writing and the communication of writing is very important, we're first and foremost after productivities and ideas, not perfect narratives or solid answers. That's what we edit as we go through the journey. But we've got to start with something in order to be able to edit it. Now, I'm going to offer you a free writing exercise. Now, that's not for saying you have to do it now, because you certainly don't. I want to sort of move on to a couple of other things before we wrap up. But it's sometimes useful to practice in response to a prompt. I've got a prompt for you. The biggest obstacle I face in my writing right now is. Now, if you feel like you'd like to give this exercise a try, either handwritten or typed, take 8 minutes, and you're always welcome to email it to me, to share with me, and to, you know, to start a conversation separate from this. I'm not asking you to do this activity now. I'm not even asking that you have to share it with me because, as I said, this is really for you, but you're welcome to share. But you're here to think about writing. You're here to think about those processes in our research. So why not take a go and do a free writing exercise based on the biggest obstacle I face in my writing right now is, and see what you come up with. You'll actually be quite surprised with the sorts of things you put onto paper. All right, there are some obstacles. Now, these are not meant to actually give you hints, but there's a lot of obstacles that we have to academic writing. The first one, the need for quality time to write, laziness, not knowing one's audience, confidence, getting started and having that blank page, not feeling that one knows enough yet, so imposter syndrome or concern that you don't know everything, so why would you start with it? Personal or external pressures and distractions, fear of the supervisor and the reader, which is probably very rational, the size or the scope of the project, which is again why, if you're doing something every day from a writing perspective, that project becomes much more manageable as time goes on. Often we use the excuse of not having done enough research yet, so I don't really know enough yet. But you can tell me what you do know. And that's a great starting point. Not having a writing routine. So again, you have to get back to that. Not having hard deadlines. So unlike undergraduate, when, you had an essay due on Friday, this is your PhD. It's due when you're ready, but you've got to set that. And you might have teaching commitments. The biggest obstacle, though, is not having clear research questions or a hypothesis. So that's important. And that might stump us or sort of, trip us up a little bit in the early days. Our solutions are pretty easy. And I sort of want to rush through these because I want to move on to the Q&A time. But keeping a notebook, practicing different types of writing, learning to hand in unfinished pieces of work to your supervisor. Okay, that's the most important thing. A lot of supervisors want to see a polished piece of work, but they're also there to give you guidance and to give you feedback along the way. You should never be afraid to hand in something incomplete and say, this is the direction I'm heading. Can I have your opinion, please? And get that. And if you're too scared for your supervisor to see it, look towards other people, mentors or others who are understanding of your research. They don't have to be experts in the area because it's simply your role as a researcher. Your role is about communicating research to other people. So if you can explain your research to me, or you can hand me an unfinished piece, and I can say to you, you know what, I understand that. You've completed, or not completed, you've succeeded in a good role of your research, which is about communication. Learn to start writing even when the topic isn't perfectly grasped. So you might only understand parts of it, but write about the parts that you do understand. Write questions about the parts you don't so that you can answer. Use writing to explore the problem rather than to solve it. So you want to develop those linkages. Writing is a research tool. It's not only communicating the completed ideas, but it's about helping you to answer questions along the way as well. And, they always say, look, the best way to learn something is to teach it. So as you write it, it's like teaching. You've got to get it into your mind, you've got to shape it up, you've got to reconfigure it, and you've got to put it out to somebody else, which is why if I say, you send it to me and I can understand it, you've done well. But it is a tool. So use that to help you. Think upon writing as a skill, a lifelong process, of course it is. Experiment with your voice, your style. the way in which you structure, experiment more with free writing, and establish routines for writing. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through this. It's about audiences for writing. So how many different readers or audiences are typically addressed in a PhD? As you start to firm up your dissertation, you've now got to start about thinking through the style to address, to reach out to the different types of readers or audiences that you need. Now, this is about grammar or structures of sentences. It is about choice of vocabulary. It is about simplifying complex ideas so that they are explained clearly to somebody who both has the terminology, but also to somebody who may not. And it's also about simply making sure that a person has a good chance of picking up our dissertation and being able to understand it as it's written. Now, I'm just going to give you a few examples of audiences, because it's not just we're writing for our PhD supervisor. It's not just they're writing for the examiners. There's others. We've got the wider community. We've got potential publishers. We've got students, because we've all read different dissertations during our student journey. We've got non-specialists or general readers who want to learn something new. We've got other academic students. We've got sympathetic readers, which I think we should just call them family. You know, family members say, oh, that's lovely, that's really nice, but they have no idea what they read. But they're always going to be that. You're going to have hostile readers, people who are there to pick holes in what you've got. And the importance of understanding this is we get so fixated about what we want to write and what we want to say, we sometimes forget that we might leave a couple of holes where others can criticize us. So part of our writing journey is making sure that we can answer almost every possible question that we have in the process first, so that people who are going to be critical of us have less opportunity to be critical. We're going to have ideal readers who, you know, literally want to support us. We're going to have competitors. And more importantly, I think that the main audience that we have is the future you. Because over our 3 to 5 years, typically, of our PhD journey, we change, our writing changes. And we want to be able to see at the end how different our thinking, our structuring, our explanations are going to be. And I give an example. I'm going to challenge you to do this as well. I go back a long time, and this is my master's thesis that I'm holding up now. It's a horrible document from the 90s. And when I look at it, I read and I cringe at everything I wrote. But when I look at my writing now, I see, you know what? The journey was worth it. I see how far I have come along all of those years. And, you know, we're talking 25 plus years anyway. But I see the progress. And I think the future you is important because this is a milestone in your lifetime journey. It's a milestone in your career, whether you stay as an academic or not. But it gives you something to show not only that 3 to 5 years start to end how you changed, but how you changed further down the track. So writing is really important because it helps us appreciate the development that we've had. Now, we're going to have periods of time where reality is it's very difficult to just sit. You know, I might sit down and I may only get that same word out over and over again. And I'm thinking, you know what, this is unproductive. So work on something that relates to writing but isn't actually writing. So bibliographic work in terms of, you know, getting new references, you know, new articles or chapters or dissertations that you can read, that you can look at, maybe digging through a couple of the existing things you've got to track down some of the source documents or so forth. It's not writing, but it's getting you thinking about the ideas that you will want to write about. You've got clerical work, which is simply just tidying things up and, you know, addressing some of the basic things. It might be emails within the university. It might be things for conferences or so forth. Again, it's peripheral to where you are, but it's going to get you hopefully inspired somewhere or motivated, or it's going to remind you about something. Reread your free writing. Now, here's the thing. You know, you probably think I advocate free writing too much, and maybe I do, but I do believe it's a valuable long-term tool. I never throw away aspects of free writing. In fact, absolutely everything that I do that's written down on paper, I have dated and I have in a file, because at times I'm going to want to go back to it. And this is why it's important never to cross anything out, because something you thought about in your earlier phases of your research that you jotted down, that you tried to articulate, but you probably didn't take further, might have meant nothing back then, but it may give you a new area, or it may give you something to explore today. And the only way, or one of the only ways for us to remember that, is to actually be reminded of it. So rereading it, rethinking about things, it helps us, you know, remember things we've forgotten. It helps us understand why we've shaped our ideas a different way. It helps our rationale in saying, you know what, I didn't like this idea. I still don't like this idea. But at least the acknowledgement of what you don't like is as important as the acknowledgement of what you do like. So rereading is valuable. And read secondary material. You know, go back to some of the less popular journal articles. Read something that's peripheral, just to get you thinking, because reading is both for knowledge, but the more we read, especially the more academic content we read, the more we can identify styles of writing that we like, the more we can identify, you know what, I want to be able to write like this academic. And that might give us an inspiration, because we say, you know what, I'm going to try this format. I'm going to try this structure and see if I can replicate it and see if I can do it. So it does actually have a really great springboard for us. Now I'm just going to move into the last slide before I do a Q&A session. I apologize. I know I've gone somewhat over time. Let's have a look. I'm going to just deal with some perspectives and advice on here. There is no single correct way of writing a PhD thesis or developing your skills. You've got to work out what that is for you, but the only way you can work out what that is for you is by trying a lot of different things. Sometimes, you know, floundering around, getting yourself in the wrong direction, it's just part of the research process. And it is actually part of true learning. So embrace it, learn from it. You know, we all make mistakes, but we have to think, what did I get from that? And there is things we get from it. As long as you keep writing regularly, your skills, your confidence, and your empowerment will improve. So learn to make the most of different types of writing associated with your research. So the notes, the literature reviews, the diaries, as well as chapters. Learn to share your work with others in an unfinished state so that you can get early feedback, and so that people can say to you, look, I don't think the style works, but the content does, or something like that. But take all of that feedback and help it to enable you to grow. Identify people who can be sympathetic readers that you can share your work to before you show it to your supervisor. So if you belong to a writing group, for example, which I think a lot of students do, share with each other first. It doesn't mean share, a huge amount. Share a few pages just so you can get some feedback and some different viewpoints on it. Because you've got to remember, even though, I keep saying, the thesis is yours, the PhD is your process. If your supervisor doesn't like it, it doesn't make it wrong, but it certainly adds the stress to us. And most importantly, remember that writing is a means as well as an end, okay? It's the final, the edited written product is what the world sees of your research. But the process during those 3 to 5 years of writing everything is what makes you and what gets you started on the journey to being a great researcher. So I'm going to wrap up and let there be a Q&A session. Thank you for listening to what I wanted to share. In the time we've got, I can't talk about a lot of things, but what I wanted to do is share some of the approaches to get you more productive as a writer. So I hope that I've managed to be able to achieve that tonight. So hand over for a Q&A session.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Craig. So in the chat box, we have one question. If nobody is convenient to read our proposal draft before sending to supervisor, can you suggest the strategy how to proof it by ourselves effectively?
Okay, if you're in a situation that nobody can read it, I don't believe that's going to be the case, all right? There's always going to be someone. And what I suggest is you're not about finding another PhD who can read it. You're finding about somebody, even within your family or friend group, who doesn't quite understand what you're doing, but you're wanting to make sure it's clear. So there will always be somebody to read it. But let's address your very specific question. Okay, how can I proofread it myself effectively? When we write something, we are so entangled into the writing that we don't see a lot of mistakes. And I'm very guilty of this. When I do my writing, I overlook mistakes because I read what I wanted to say. I don't read what I typed out. And the only way I can effectively work with this is two strategies. One, I have to give myself a break, a time period between the writing and looking at it. And I usually consider 48 hours to be an acceptable time period. I have 2 days, 48 hours where I've not looked at or been involved with my research, so that when I come back to it, my thought patterns have been focused on everything else that's happened in my life. The shopping, now we've got the pandemic to worry about, what I cook, doing a bit of gardening, but all of that takes me back a step. Now, my second strategy for this is I'm very OCD in the way I do things. So I always use Arial font. It's always size 12. There will never, ever be a difference. That's a mindset. So what I do is I challenge myself. I put my document into Times New Roman size 14 because I can never believe it will be my document. Now, that's enough of a mental break that when I take a look at it, I see things ever so slightly differently. So I've got a chance to look at where something might be incomplete or where something doesn't fit together. I may still not get the spelling mistakes or the grammar mistakes if I make them. but it will help me to be able to focus on what is conceptually there and whether the communication of that has been clear. I think if you're in a situation, you use the word if nobody is convenient, you might want to pay a professional service to read and to review. And, you don't have to look at a professional service that's in your neighborhood. COVID has meant all of us are so many different places in the world today that you can send it somewhere to have feedback. But if you're going to do that, make sure you can trust the person. Okay, so you've got to make sure they're not going to steal it and on-sell it to somebody else. That's always going to be an issue. But I think come back, take a break from your research, 48 hours, look at it freshly, put it into a different layout, i.e. different font size. Little things to trick your brain, to make your brain feel that it's new for you. And that's going to get you somewhere down there. Then you can use tools, external tools. You've got your spell checker in Microsoft Word, for example. You've got Grammarly. Okay, Grammarly is unfortunately gaining popularity. I'm not a fan, so I'm not going to sell you a Grammarly package. I'm not even going to suggest you should, but consider it. Grammarly, to me, is a little too flowery. It's going to take your academic writing and make it look like a sales pitch. But Grammarly is also very good for highlighting areas that, this isn't clear enough. So it does give you an opportunity to be able to think, okay, so they've identified this. You don't have to take their suggestion. Your job as a good researcher is, okay, this area is unclear. Let me go back and rewrite it. And that's what you can do. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. He or she are looking forward to know what is the best writing style for our staff to apply.
Okay, so how do I find my own personal style? Practice and feedback. As I said, I went through. This was my first real piece of academic writing, and I keep it with me, not because it's good, it's terrible, it's crap, but it's a reminder of where I came from. What made me good as an academic writer, or what made me improve, because I'm not sure I'm good, I'm just, improving constantly. But what made me improve was really getting feedback, getting other people on my writing. What also really made me improve is looking at the writing of researchers that I respected a lot and trying to emulate their style. Our own style will happen naturally, and it may become quite a surprise to us, but it really does just come from practice. The more we practice, the better we become as a writer. And that, I believe, works across every language. It's not just how do I, write stronger in English, for example. It's for every single language. Okay, Turnitin is a very exclusive plagiarism checker. Do you have preferences other than that? To be honest, okay, I was one of the first generation academics to use Turnitin back in the very early 2000s when it was introduced into the university I was lecturing at. I actually don't like it. I don't believe that it is a great system. I believe it's a good system, don't get me wrong. I don't believe it is a great system. And I don't believe that we should be contracting out our responsibility to write properly to a computer algorithm. What we should be looking at is how do we review our own writing and our processes as we write to make sure that we are eliminating plagiarism itself. If you want a package, yes, Turnitin is definitely there, and that's fine. But the problems with Turnitin is, ultimately speaking, the database will be full. Now, there is a theory of learning that suggests that at different places across the world at the same time, people will come up with the same concepts. So at any one period of time, 6 to 8 people could be coming up with the same theory. Now, the problem is they're not connected to each other. They're not working with each other. This is pre-technology stuff. But Turnitin will tell us 7 of those 8 people plagiarized off the other person. So I don't personally believe Turnitin to be a robust system. I think the onus still must come back to us as individuals. And how do I then de-plagiarize my work? It really does come down to having confidence in your own voice as a writer, as a researcher, and to be able to share and to express things in the way that you would naturally speak them, rather than what you could conveniently take from somebody else.
Still have one more question here for you.
Yes, go for
it. Okay. When is the best time to write the abstract?
Okay, that's a cool question. You're going to hear different pieces of advice on this. A lot of people say write the abstract at the end after everything's been completed. And I think you write the absolute best abstract right at the end. But I'm going to say, you know what? Write your abstract early on in the process as well. Because as with everything, it should be fluid. It should be able to be changed as you go through. But if you write it at the beginning, you're using this like a tunnel, and you're going through that tunnel. It's a guide for you. And you can always change your abstract and change that tunnel a little bit or change the direction, but it's still a guide for you. So my advice is have a working abstract that you update every so often, that changes. Remember, everything's interrelated. So it changes with your development as a researcher and your output and your progress with the research. But at the end, when you're, finalizing and editing everything to submit, then's the point to say, okay, my working abstract, did it serve its purpose? Is it strong enough, robust enough to use now? Or should I rewrite this, in a different way? So definitely write it the last thing, but look at having that working abstract. And I just want to go back. I see Janine added a question or a comment to what I made my comments about Turnitin. Thank you so much. Oops. Just confused because most publishers check journals using that service. Okay, truth is, yes, most publishers do. It's convenient, and it is an industry standard. But I think the more you train yourself as a researcher, the less you need a service like that. I personally think it's fantastic for checking undergraduate student essays, but I'm not a fan of it beyond that. Thank you for joining. I hope to see you at the next sessions.